Picture this: the glittering ballrooms of the Gilded Age, where diamonds sparkled brighter than honesty, and the whispers behind silk fans cut deeper than any knife. In this world of old money and even older grudges, one woman's revenge would shake high society to its core. She wasn't a duchess or a debutante. No, she was the secretary, the invisible hand behind the throne, the one who knew every secret, every lie, every skeleton rattling in the gilded closet. And when she finally decided to strike back, the fallout was nothing short of spectacular. This is the story of a betrayal so cunning, it could have been lifted straight from a scandal sheet, except every outrageous detail is true. It's a tale of power, pride, and the quiet fury of a woman who'd been underestimated one too many times, the heiress, or perhaps the royal thought her secretary was just another pawn, easily discarded. But oh, how wrong she was, because when you push someone too far, especially someone who holds all the cards, the revenge they serve won't just be cold, it'll be exquisitely, ruthlessly personal. So how does a woman with no title, no fortune, and supposedly no leverage bring a society queen to her knees? That's where things get deliciously dark. From forged letters to carefully planted rumors, from sabotaged marriages to the sudden disappearance of a certain family heirloom, this revenge plot had it all. And the best part, by the time the heiress realized what was happening, it was far too late to stop it. So settle in, because we're about to unravel every twisted thread of this scandal, piece by jaw-dropping piece. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment of the secretary's vengeance, a masterclass in turning the tables with style, wit, and just the right amount of malice. Before she became the architect of high society's most shocking downfall, she was just another face in the crowd, a woman with ink-stained fingers and quiet determination. The secretary didn't come from grand ballrooms or trust funds. Her world was one of cramped apartments and second-hand dresses, where every penny was pinched and opportunities were handed out like favors to the already fortunate. Yet here she was, navigating the gilded halls of the elite, absorbing their secrets like sunlight through stained glass. At first, she was grateful just to be near that glittering world, even if her role meant fading into the wallpaper. But gratitude has its limits. The heiress she served treated her less like a confidante and more like a piece of furniture, something to lean on when convenient, then ignore. The slights were small at first, a dismissive wave when fetching tea, a mocking laugh at her unfashionable gloves, the way her employer would forget to introduce her at parties as if she were invisible. And then came the real betrayals. Promises of advancement vanished like smoke. Credit for her ideas was stolen outright. Worst of all, the day she overheard the heiress joking with friends about the little mouse who does all my dirty work. That was the moment the first seed of revenge took root. What the elite never understood was how much they relied on her, not just for schedules and correspondence, but for the unspoken labor of smoothing their scandals under the rug. She knew which suitor was secretly bankrupt, which family fortune was built on swindled land, even whose diamond necklace was actually paste. They mistook her silence for meekness. But silence isn't empty, it's a vault, collecting every careless word, every unguarded moment, and vaults, as any thief knows, are meant to be cracked open when the time is right. The heiress moved through life as if the world owed her every luxury, because in her mind it did. Born with a silver spoon so polished, it blinded her to reality. She treated those beneath her not as people, but as extensions of her own whims. Servants were props, secretaries were glorified note-takers, and anyone without a title or fortune might as well have been wallpaper. But none bore the brunt of her arrogance quite like our heroine, the woman who organized her life, mended her mistakes, and absorbed her cruelty with a smile that never reached her eyes. There was a time the heiress tossed a stack of invitations into the fire because the ink was too blue for her taste, forcing the secretary to rewrite 200 by hand through the night. Or the afternoon, she deliberately spilled tea on freshly penned letters, laughing as she demanded they be redone, without the dreadful smudges. The worst offences, though, were the private humiliations, the way she'd snap her fingers instead of using the secretary's name, or mock her modest upbringing between bites of caviar. Darling, she once drawled to a room of tittering friends, do remind us again how many generations it takes to breed out the smell of cheap soap. The room had erupted in laughter. The secretary had simply folded her hands and memorized every face. What the heiress failed to grasp was this: cruelty is a ledger. Every slight, every sneer, every moment of calculated degradation was being recorded, not in some tattered diary, but in the steel-trapped mind of a woman who'd spent years learning how power really worked. While the heiress flitted from ballroom to yacht, the secretary was studying not just how to forge a signature or intercept a telegram, but which scandals could ruin a reputation, which debts were best left unmentioned, and exactly how far a proper lady would go to keep her secrets buried. The arrogance wasn't merely insulting, it was strategic blindness. The heiress never noticed when her correspondence went missing for an hour, only to reappear with seals intact. She didn't question why certain guests suddenly cancelled appearances after whispered warnings, and it certainly never occurred to her that the quiet woman in the corner, the one she'd ordered to stand during meetings to keep her alert, might be the one holding the knife, waiting for the perfect moment to plunge it straight between the ribs of her glittering reputation. It started with a love letter, or rather, the absence of one. The secretary had been quietly courting a young musician, a violinist with kind eyes who didn't care about pedigree or bank balances. Their notes were slipped between sheet music, their meetings stolen in the shadowy corners of intermission. It was the one thing in her life untouched by the heiress's cruelty until the night of the winter ball. That evening, she arrived early to arrange the seating charts, only to freeze at the sound of familiar laughter drifting from the conservatory. There, pressed against the grand piano in a haze of champagne and candlelight, was the heiress, her lips curled in triumph as the violinist's hands tangled in her pearls. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was theatrical. The heiress made sure of that. Later, surrounded by her circle of admirers, she'd sigh dramatically and claim the musician had practically begged for her attention. But what can one do? She'd purred, flicking her fan. Talent is so desperate. The room had erupted in knowing giggles. The secretary, standing stiffly by the punch bowl, felt something inside her snap. But the true insult came the next morning. Summoned to the heiress's boudoir, she expected dismissal, or perhaps another round of veiled mockery. Instead, she was handed a stack of envelopes, each one a love letter she'd written, now marked in red ink with grammatical corrections. Darling, the heiress yawned, examining her nails. If you're going to embarrass yourself, at least do it without dangling participles. Then, as if delivering the final blow, besides, he told me your prose was tiresome. All those metaphors about stars and music really, so provincial. The lie was as transparent as the heiress's attempts to provoke her, but in that moment, clarity struck like lightning. This wasn't just about stolen affection or petty humiliation. It was about power, the power to rewrite reality itself. The heiress didn't steal her letters to mock them. She stole them because they were evidence. Proof that someone, even for a moment, had chosen the secretary over her, and that was the one thing her money and title couldn't abide. As she gathered the defaced pages, something shifted. The grief hardened into resolve, the shame into strategy, because now she understood the game completely. If the heiress could erase her happiness with a laugh and a red pen, then she'd return the favor, not with tears, but with the one thing the elite truly valued, their own reflection. And oh, what a twisted mirror she'd hold up to them all. The inkwell became her weapon of choice, not for love letters anymore, but for something far more lethal: accountability. That night, after the winter ball debacle, the secretary didn't weep into her pillow. She lit a single candle, pulled a leather-bound ledger from beneath her mattress, and opened to the first blank page. This wasn't a diary, it was a dossier. Every slight, every stolen idea, every humiliating errand now had its place in a growing catalogue of the heiress's sins. But the real gems, those came from the secrets she'd been forced to clean up. Take the charity gala, where the heiress had loudly donated $5,000 to orphans, a sum quietly siphoned from her younger brother's trust fund. Or the time she'd feigned illness to avoid a debt collector, only to host a champagne-soaked soiree that same evening. The secretary recorded it all: dates, amounts, even the names of witnesses who could confirm the truth. She noted the heiress's affair with the married banker, the forged signatures on loan documents, even the whispered conversation about a certain emerald necklace lost under suspicious circumstances before the insurance payout. What made the ledger truly dangerous wasn't just the scandals, it was the context. A single affair might raise eyebrows, but paired with financial discrepancies and a pattern of lies, that could topple an empire, and the secretary had a front row seat to every hypocrisy. When the heiress mocked a rival for wearing imitation jewels, the ledger noted her own wardrobe expenses, far exceeding her allowance. When she lectured servants about honesty, the pages recalled the time she'd bribed a footman to lie about a broken vase. The brilliance of her system lay in its simplicity. She wrote in code, using music terminology only she understood. A fortissimo entry marked explosive scandals. Pianissimo indicated whispers too delicate to share yet. And tucked between the pages, physical evidence, a torn corner of a compromising letter, a theatre ticket stub from an illicit rendezvous, even a pressed flower from the garden where the heiress had met her lover. Most revenge plots rely on rage, but hers thrived on patience. She didn't just want the heiress exposed, she wanted her dismantled piece by piece, every golden illusion stripped away until nothing remained but the truth. And with each passing day, the ledger grew heavier, its pages swelling with the weight of secrets waiting to sing. Revenge, as they say, is a dish best served with witnesses, and the secretary knew better than to dine alone. While the heiress twirled through ballrooms, oblivious, her shadow was stitching together a tapestry of resentment from those who'd also tasted her cruelty. It began with the housemaids, the ones who'd been fired for daring to cough during the heiress's afternoon naps, or scolded for leaving fingerprints on the silver. A strategically placed word here, a sympathetic ear there, and suddenly the secretary had eyes in every corridor. Then came the gardener, a man who'd nurtured roses for 20 years only to have them ripped out because the heiress decided they clashed with her new parasol. He didn't just share gossip about late-night visits to the greenhouse with unsuitable company, he provided keys to private gates. The dismissed chauffeur, still seething over being blamed for a scratch on the carriage that wasn't his fault, happily confirmed which backroads the heiress used for clandestine trips. Even the pastry chef, whose wedding cake design the heiress had stolen and passed off as her own, began slipping notes between layers of sponge and buttercream, details about which guests were allergic to nuts and which might appreciate a special dessert laced with truth. But the real coup, the rivals, the society women who'd been slighted at tea parties, their marriage prospects sabotaged over whispered rumors, their hemlines mocked until they were social pariahs. These weren't just allies, they were artillery. One had letters proving the heiress's father had bribed his way into a prestigious club. Another possessed a diary chronicling a certain emerald necklace's disappearance after a card game gone wrong. The secretary's genius lay in her approach. She never asked outright for help. That would leave a trail. Instead, she let grievances simmer until they boiled over on their own, then handed people the perfect spoon to stir the pot. A dropped hint about the heiress mocking a friend's singing voice, an accidental glimpse of the ledger's juiciest entries left open on a desk. Each recruit thought they were acting on their own vendetta, never realizing they'd become part of something far grander, a symphony of spite, with the secretary as its silent conductor. By the time the heiress's inner circle noticed missing jewelry or strange whispers at parties, the web was already woven, the butler who forgot to deliver messages, the lady's maid who misplaced crucial invitations, even the heiress's favorite lapdog, a creature as spoiled as its owner, suddenly developed a habit of shredding important documents. Every slight had ripened into retaliation, and the best part, no one could trace it back to the quiet woman in the corner, the one who smiled politely while the house of cards began to tremble. The poison pen letters arrived like clockwork, precisely timed to ruin the heiress's most cherished moments. The first appeared on the morning of her much-anticipated garden party, slipped between the pages of the society column she adored. At first glance, it seemed innocent enough, a cream-colored envelope, the kind used for calling cards, but inside, a masterclass in subtle destruction. Written in flawless script, just different enough from the secretary's usual hand to avoid suspicion, the letter detailed the heiress's most embarrassing secret, her frantic, middle-of-the-night dash to a back-alley dentist after cracking a tooth on smuggled caramel. The story itself was mortifying, but the true genius lay in the execution. The writer praised the heiress's unwavering commitment to sweets, while slyly noting how odd it was that she'd skipped her own charity's dental fund 2 years prior. Every word dripped with polite concern, every sentence laced with damning specificity. By noon, half the guests were stifling giggles behind their fans. By tea time, someone accidentally left the letter near the lemonade table, where it made the rounds like a particularly delicious scandal. The heiress turned scarlet when she finally saw it, her voice shrill as she insisted it was all lies. But the damage was done. The details were too precise, the caramel imported from Belgium, the dentist sign swinging crookedly in the rain is to be invented. Someone knew, and that someone was watching. The second letter arrived at the opera, tucked into the program of her greatest rival. This one recounted the heiress's disastrous attempt to bribe a singing coach into declaring her the finest soprano of their generation, only to be caught mid-bribe by the very diva she'd hoped to surpass. Again, the tone was deceptively light, framing the incident as a charming display of enthusiasm, but the subtext was clear. She was a fraud, and worse, a clumsy one. Each subsequent letter exploited a new weakness. One revealed her habit of rewriting party guest lists after the fact to claim she'd hosted more prestigious names. Another exposed her borrowing a friend's gown design and pretending it was original. The secretary's brilliance was in her restraint. She never accused, only insinuated. She let the facts humiliate on their own, seeding doubt in every polished interaction. The heiress's frantic denials only made her look guiltier. When she stormed into the printer's shop demanding to know who'd commissioned the stationery, they had no record. When she interrogated servants, their baffled expressions seemed genuine because the secretary had used paper pilfered from the heiress's own desk. The trap was airtight, and every attempt to escape it only tightened the snare. But the cruelest twist, the letters always highlighted the heiress's hypocrisy. The woman who lectured on propriety was caught cheating at cards. The patroness of orphans had mocked a child's patched dress. With each revelation, her carefully constructed image cracked a little more, revealing the petty, insecure woman beneath. And the secretary, she watched it all unfold from the shadows, her face a mask of quiet efficiency, just a loyal employee, fetching shawls and taking notes, while her employer's reputation crumbled one elegantly worded letter at a time. The heiress had nearly secured her most prized catch yet, a titled aristocrat with sprawling estates and a fortune untouched by scandal, or so he believed. The courtship had been textbook perfection, stolen glances at the opera, chaperoned strolls through his family's famed rose gardens, even a whispered promise of an emerald engagement ring hidden in his safe. Society pages already buzzed with anticipation, but the secretary saw something the heiress had missed, the man's brittle pride, his terror of being mocked. And that was a lever waiting to be pressed. It started with a misplaced diary entry left conspicuously in the conservatory where the suitor took his morning coffee. The page detailed the heiress's laughter over his clumsiness in the quadrille, her cruel imitation of his stilted French. The words weren't fabricated, they were lifted verbatim from an evening the secretary had witnessed. But the real stroke of genius, pairing it with a forged note from the heiress to her closest friend, "Darling, must I really marry a man who smells of damp hunting dogs? Though I suppose his vault at Coutts will perfume anything," the effect was instantaneous. The suitor cancelled their next 3 engagements with increasingly terse notes. When the heiress finally cornered him at the Whitney ball, his jaw was clenched so tightly she could barely hear his hissed accusation, "You find me ridiculous." Her stammered denials only confirmed his suspicions. By midnight, he'd left for his country estate and taken the emerald ring with him, but the secretary wasn't done. For the next prospect, a railroad tycoon's son with a weakness for fragile egos, she deployed a different tactic. Through her network of maids, she ensured his morning newspaper arrived with a certain society column circled in red ink. There, buried between announcements of betrothals and garden parties, was a seemingly innocuous item, a mention of the heiress's uncanny ability to rehabilitate gentlemen of, let's call it, uneven reputation. The phrasing implied what it didn't state outright, that he was just another charity case. He sent his regrets via telegram before breakfast. The crowning touch came with the Italian count, a man whose old-world sensibilities couldn't abide even a whiff of impropriety. The secretary knew he took tea every Tuesday at the Grand Hotel. She also knew the head waiter's sister had been fired for refusing to launder the heiress's mud-stained petticoats. A discreetly passed envelope later, and the count found his usual table, accidentally, near 2 gossiping matrons. Their conversation, loud enough to carry, revolved around the heiress's midnight carriage, rides with a married cavalry officer. The details were artfully vague, the dates carefully chosen to coincide with periods the count had been abroad. By the time his scone arrived, he'd already summoned his carriage. What made the sabotage so devastating wasn't just the precision, it was the plausible deniability. No direct accusations, no confrontations, just perfectly placed whispers, strategically vanished correspondence, and the heiress's own words thrown back at her like boomerangs. Each failed courtship left her more frantic, her explanations growing shriller as suitors drifted away like leaves on a guilty breeze. And through it all, the secretary remained the picture of loyalty, murmuring consolation, while her employer's prospects and sanity unraveled stitch by calculated stitch. Money is power, and the secretary knew exactly where to cut. While the heiress fretted over broken engagements, her fortune was quietly hemorrhaging not from extravagance, but from the meticulous sabotage of the woman who balanced her books. It began with the small things, a misplaced decimal point in the household ledger, an overpayment to the florist that mysteriously vanished before reaching its destination. The heiress never noticed, why would she? Numbers were for clerks and shopkeepers, not for women who could summon champagne with a snap of their fingers. Then came the investments. The secretary had spent years listening to the heiress's father lecture about finance, absorbing which stocks were shaky, which bonds could be manipulated. So when she accidentally misfiled a letter from the family broker, redirecting a sizable sum into a failing railroad venture, it seemed like an honest mistake. The heiress's signature on the transfer form, a near-perfect replica, practiced on discarded stationery until the loops matched flawlessly. By the time the railroad collapsed, taking $30,000 with it, the secretary had already planted the idea that the heiress herself had approved the gamble, bragging about her sharp instincts at a dinner party. Charity became another weapon. The heiress loved the optics of philanthropy, but hated parting with actual coin, so the secretary took liberties. Donations to the Women's Temperance Union, an organization the heiress openly mocked, were suddenly doubled, with receipts sent directly to the society pages. Funds earmarked for a new ball gown somehow ended up sponsoring a library for factory girls. Each era forced the heiress to either publicly own the generosity or admit she'd been outmaneuvered by her own staff. But the masterstroke was the loans. The secretary had watched the heiress's brother borrow against his inheritance with ruinous interest rates. Now she engineered introductions to the same predatory lenders, whispering how the heiress desperately needed discretion after unfortunate losses at the track. The terms were brutal, the collateral her favorite jewels, and when payment came due, mysteriously, the secretary's ledger showed the dates incorrectly by just enough to incur late fees that snowballed into disasters. Through it all, the facade held. The secretary wept prettily over her careless mistakes, even offering to dock her own wages, a pittance compared to the sums vanishing. She suggested austerity measures that alienated the heiress's friends, no more imported champagne, how dreary, and watched as panic set in, the cruelest twist. The heiress couldn't even accuse her without admitting she'd been outsmarted, because in the end, the secretary's greatest revenge wasn't stealing her money, it was proving the heiress wasn't half as clever as she thought. The invitation arrived on thick cream cardstock, embossed with the crest of Lady Rutherford, a social titan whose approval the heiress had spent years desperately courting. The wording was perfection itself, an intimate dinner for 20 of society's most distinguished minds, honoring your recent philanthropy. Never mind that the heiress's sole charitable act had been donating moth-eaten ball gowns to an orphanage. The secretary had crafted the bait with surgical precision, down to the RSVP deadline just 48 hours away, ensuring panic would override scrutiny. Of course, the heiress fell for it instantly. She preened for days, practicing witticisms in her mirror and ordering a scandalously low-cut gown in Rutherford blue. The secretary even overheard her rehearsing how to graciously accept the inevitable marriage proposals this coup would inspire, but behind the scenes, wheels were turning. The real Lady Rutherford was conveniently vacationing in Biarritz, her butler bribed to confirm the private event if anyone called to verify. The chef at the specified restaurant, a subpar establishment the heiress had once publicly derided, was promised triple his usual fee to play along. Even the florist was in on it, delivering wilting peonies, as requested to underscore the insult. The night of the dinner, the heiress arrived in a diamond choker and a cloud of rose perfume, only to find the restaurant's private dining room lit by a single flickering sconce. A lone table stood draped in stained linens, set with chipped china and a handwritten placard, reserved for the lady who dines on others' reputations. Worse yet, the adjacent room hosted an actual society gathering, filled with the very people she'd hoped to impress. Their muffled laughter carried through the thin walls as confusion turned to horrified comprehension. By the time she realized the ruse, The damage was irreversible. The secretary had ensured forgotten gloves sent the heiress back inside 3 times, each pass drawing more attention from the real partygoers. A waiter accidentally spilled burgundy down her décolletage while apologizing a touch too loudly about the lady who wasn't on the list, and as the piece de resistance. A toast from the next room, glasses clinking to the folly of social climbers, a phrase that just happened to be the heiress's own favorite insult. The carriage ride home was silent, save for the sound of satin gloves shredding between clenched fingers. But the true brilliance of the scheme wasn't the humiliation, it was the aftermath, because when the heiress demanded retribution, no one believed her. The restaurant staff swore no reservation existed under Rutherford's name. The florist produced an order form with the heiress's own looping signature, another skill the secretary had perfected. Even her friends gently suggested she'd misunderstood the invitation after all. Everyone knew Lady Rutherford detested last-minute plans. In the end, the fake dinner did more than wound her pride, it gaslit her entire reality. The secretary had weaponized the heiress's greatest weakness, her pathological need to be seen as the cleverest person in the room. Now, that very room was laughing at her, and the cruelest joke of all. She couldn't even prove it was intentional. The emerald necklace had been in the heiress's family for generations, a gaudy, overpriced thing she wore less out of affection and more to flaunt its insured value. But its real worth lay in the legend, lose it, and disgrace followed. That superstition made it the perfect linchpin for the secretary's next move. She began by planting seeds of doubt. A casual remark to the housekeeper about how the heiress had been forgetful lately, a hissed whisper between footmen that the necklace had been spotted in a pawnshop window. Just a glimpse, mind you, probably nothing. Then came the staged mishaps. The jewelry box left ajar after the heiress's maid, disturbingly, found it unlocked. The safe door mysteriously unlatched after a soiree. Each incident seemed like carelessness, each whisper just plausible enough to stick. The night of the Vandermeer ball was the masterpiece. The secretary ensured the heiress wore the emeralds, then arranged a distraction, a spilled glass of claret on a rival's gown, while an accomplice, the dismissed gardener's daughter, now a chambermaid at the venue, slipped into the cloakroom. The necklace vanished into a hidden pocket, the clasp deliberately weakened to suggest it had fallen, but the real artistry was in the timing. Moments before the theft, the secretary overheard the heiress complaining loudly about her father's stinginess with the allowance, making sure the right ears caught every word. Chaos erupted when the loss was discovered. The heiress tore through the ballroom, accusing guests and servants alike, her desperation fueling the rumors already circling like vultures. By dawn, the story had mutated. She'd sold it to cover debts, gambled it away, even hidden it to spite her family. No one noticed the secretary's quiet exchange with the pawnbroker's nephew, nor the way the necklace resurfaced weeks later in the hands of a charity auctioneer, donated anonymously with a note praising the heiress's sudden change of heart. The final twist, the insurance payment was denied. The secretary had leaked the evidence of the heiress's financial troubles to the investigators, along with a forged ledger entry hinting she'd planned the disappearance. The family erupted, not at the loss, but at the scandal, because in their world, stupidity was forgivable, poverty, that was a crime, and the secretary made sure the heiress stood condemned by both. Gossip was never just idle chatter in high society, it was currency, and the secretary had learned how to spend it like a queen. While the heiress fretted over stolen emeralds and failed investments, her reputation was quietly unraveling in the drawing rooms of Manhattan, one whispered scandal at a time. The secretary didn't need to shout her employer's secrets from the rooftops. Instead, she mastered the art of the well-placed murmur. The strategic confession slipped into a sympathetic ear at just the right moment. Take the incident with the Russian countess's pearls. The heiress had indeed admired them at the Astor ball, even joking about how they'd suit her better. A harmless quip until the secretary, confided to a particularly chatty lady's, made how her employer kept a sketch of the pearls in her bedside drawer, just for inspiration. By week's end, the story had mutated into a full-blown accusation of planned theft, complete with fabricated details about a midnight rendezvous with the countess's jeweler. The heiress arrived at the opera to find her usual box suddenly reserved, while the countess's glare could have frozen champagne. Then there was the matter of the missing heirloom spoon, a trifle misplaced during a tea party, later discovered in the heiress's reticule by a conveniently observant guest. Never mind that the secretary had slipped it there herself while helping with the heiress's wrap. The real genius was in the aftermath. She tearfully begged the hostess not to press charges, citing the heiress's nervous condition and habit of taking things when overwrought. The apology dripped with such sincerity that the hostess couldn't resist sharing her compassion with everyone who'd listen, along with the damning details. But gossip wasn't just about planting lies, it was about amplifying truths. The heiress's real vices were juicy enough without embellishment, her penchant for bribing servants to spy on rivals. The secretary simply ensured those payments were made in traceable banknotes, then let a disgruntled butler stumble upon the ledger, her habit of mocking friends' misfortunes. A few strategically lost letters, left in card rooms and powder parlors, did the work beautifully. The most devastating whispers weren't even about scandal, they were about pity. Nothing infuriated the heiress more than being seen as pathetic rather than powerful, so the secretary made sure the Ton knew about her mounting debts, her failed courtships, even the way her last remaining suitor had yawned through their waltz. Society could forgive cruelty, but they'd never forgive being boring, and as the invitations dried up and the snubs grew bolder, the heiress's throne of silk and spite began to rot beneath her. The Whitney Autumn Ball was supposed to be the heiress's triumphant return to society after months of whispered scandals, a chance to prove she still commanded respect. Instead, it became her public undoing, thanks to a spectacle so perfectly timed, even the orchestra seemed to play along with the secretary's scheme. It began with a missing dance card. The heiress had spent weeks curating her partners, ensuring only the most influential names would grace her list. But when the first waltz struck up, her reticule yielded nothing but a crumpled scrap of paper bearing a single sentence: "Did you really think I wouldn't tell him?" The handwriting was unmistakably her lover's, the very cavalry officer whose wife sat just 3 tables away, her emerald parure glittering under the chandeliers. Panic flashed across the heiress's face as she scanned the room, only to lock eyes with the officer himself, his expression stormy as he gripped a nearly identical note. That's when the music stopped, not a gradual fade, but an abrupt silence that cut through the ballroom like a knife. Every head turned as the secretary, ever the dutiful shadow, hurried to the conductor with whispered apologies about a misunderstanding. The real performance, however, was just beginning. A piercing shriek echoed from the card room, where the heiress's rival dramatically fainted upon discovering a love letter tucked between the sofa cushions. The paper was genuine, plucked from the heiress's own stash, but the added postscript, "Burn this, darling, my wife is asking questions," was a masterstroke of forgery. Chaos erupted. The cavalry officer's wife lunged for her husband's lapels, his hissed denials drowned out by gasps. The heiress's frantic attempts to intervene only made her look guiltier, especially when her silk train caught on a chair, sending a cascade of wine glasses shattering across the floor along with a miniature portrait of the officer that accidentally tumbled from her bodice. The secretary had orchestrated every detail. down to the timing of the footman's arrival with smelling salts and scandalized whispers. By dawn, the story had spiraled beyond control. The heiress hadn't just dabbled in an affair, she'd flaunted it, taunted the wife, even bragged about it in writing. And the cruelest twist, no one could trace the disaster back to the quiet woman in grey who'd merely tripped into the conductor's podium, whose hands trembled so convincingly as she helped her employer into the carriage. As the wheels rolled away from the ballroom, the secretary allowed herself one small smile. The heiress had wanted to be the center of attention. Now she would be, just not in the way she'd imagined. The blackmail began not with a bang, but with a whisper delivered over morning tea in the heiress's favorite bone china cup. The secretary waited until the third sip, until the caffeine had smoothed the edges of her employer's notorious morning irritability, before sliding a single sheet of paper across the breakfast tray. It wasn't a demand, not at first glance, just a list, the dates and locations of every secret rendezvous with the cavalry officer, the exact sums skimmed from her brother's trust, even the name of the jeweler who'd crafted the lost emerald necklace's paste replica. The secretary's voice never rose above conversational as she murmured, "One wonders what the papers would pay for such comprehensive memoirs." The heiress's reaction was almost comical, a choked gasp that sent Earl Grey splashing onto her lace peignoir. For the first time in their twisted partnership, the balance of power had audibly clicked into place. What followed wasn't the crude extortion of penny dreadful novels. No, the secretary orchestrated her leverage with the precision of a concert pianist. Each request was framed as a mutual favor, a modest loan to cover her ailing mother's medical bills, triple the actual amount, a seat at the Vanderbilt musicale, where she'd be seen taking notes for the heiress's generous mentorship, even a glowing mention in the society pages as the most indispensable woman in New York. But the true artistry lay in escalation. When the heiress balked at introducing her to certain banking contacts, a misplaced ledger page mysteriously surfaced in her suitor's study, one detailing her father's collusion in a railroad swindle. When she refused to endorse the secretary's fictional charity, an anonymous letter arrived at the Archbishop's residence, detailing the heiress's long-hidden abortion. The secretary never issued threats. She simply left doors ajar, letting the heiress glimpse the precipice before offering a rope, one that always came with strings attached. The most devastating part, the transformation she engineered in public. The heiress, who'd once mocked the secretary's handwriting, now dictated florid letters singing her praises to every influential hostess. The woman who'd sneered at trade found herself loudly advocating for secretaries' wages at luncheons, while discreetly transferring funds to an account under the secretary's maiden name. Even the cruel nickname, Little Mouse, was repurposed as an affectionate jest during testimonials, yet the secretary's greatest power wasn't in what she took, but in what she gave the heiress, just enough hope to keep playing along. A carefully staged loss of the abortion letter after concessions were made, a whispered assurance that the banker's ledger could stay lost for now. The heiress clung to these crumbs of security, never realizing they were part of the design, because true control isn't about breaking someone, it's about letting them break themselves, piece by surrendered piece, while you hold the glue. The heiress's hypochondria was legendary, a quirk the secretary had noted in her ledger with clinical precision. She'd seen her employer faint at the mention of consumption, demand mercury tonics for imagined fevers, even prescribe herself bed rest after sneezing twice in succession. It wasn't just vanity, it was a lifelong obsession with fragility that made her crave both sympathy and the drama of convalescence, and that was a vulnerability begging to be exploited. The first symptom arrived with elegant subtlety. One morning, as the heiress examined herself in her vanity mirror, the secretary, noticed a faint yellow tinge to her eyes. "Perhaps the light," she murmured, then hastily changed the subject just enough to sow doubt. By afternoon, 2 maids were whispering about jaundice in the scullery. By evening, the heiress's physician, a man whose debts the secretary had quietly settled, was frowning over concerning liver function, the diagnosis. A rare tropical ailment, possibly contracted from that tainted shipment of French perfumes the heiress had bragged about importing. The genius of the scheme lay in its plausibility. The secretary didn't invent symptoms, she amplified real ones. A passing headache became neuralgia. A slight cough morphed into incipient pneumonia. She even doctored the household medical journals, slipping in articles about aristocratic women struck down by mysterious wasting diseases. And when the heiress complained of fatigue, that's when the real theatre began. The darkened rooms, the broth served in invalid cups, the sudden fainting spells, time for visits from society's most notorious gossips. Isolation followed like clockwork. Friends who'd weathered scandals with her now recoiled at the thought of contagion. The heiress's beloved soirees were replaced by the hollow echo of her own footsteps in empty parlours. Even her suitors found urgent business elsewhere, especially after the secretary confided to a rival's maid about disturbing lesions best kept hidden. The cruelest touch, the way she nursed her employer with performative devotion, murmuring about brave faces while ensuring every mirror in the house reflected a gaunt, ghostly version of the once vibrant woman. But the piece de resistance came when the secretary convinced the heiress her illness was punishment, a fortuitous visit from a spiritualist, actually the gardener's cousin, trained in melodrama, revealed shadows clinging to her aura. "Have you wronged someone powerless?" the medium intoned, clutching the heiress's trembling hands. "The universe collects its debts." The suggestion was clear. This wasn't just a sickness. It was karma, and as the heiress lay in her gilded prison, staring at the ceiling with mounting dread, she had no idea the architect of her suffering was the same woman fluffing her pillows, the one humming softly as she measured out drops of harmless tonic like a jailer counting down a sentence. The first invitation to vanish was to the Vandermeer Summer Gala, an event so exclusive even whispers about it carried social weight. The heiress only noticed its absence when the society pages printed the guest list without a name, sparking a frantic search through her mail pile. The secretary watched silently as her employer tore through envelopes, growing increasingly pale beneath her rouge. What she couldn't know was that her own stationery had been used to pen a shockingly rude decline weeks earlier, citing the tedium of provincial hostesses in handwriting nearly indistinguishable from her own. By the time she realized the slight, half of New York believed she'd snubbed the season's most coveted event out of sheer arrogance. Abandonment followed in waves. The Thursday Ladies' Luncheon Club, where the heiress had held court for a decade, suddenly found their roster full when she called to confirm the truth. A poison pen letter had circulated among members, ostensibly from the heiress, mocking their waistlines and marital prospects with surgical cruelty, even her oldest ally, the Dowager Mrs. A store began crossing the street to avoid her after an anonymous tip about the heiress betting on when the elderly matriarch would succumb to gout. But the true masterpiece was the opera box incident. For generations, her family's seats had been sacrosanct until the night ushers barred her entrance, politely insisting the boxes had been relinquished. The secretary's forged letter to the house manager was a thing of beauty, rambling, wine-stained, and full of drunken disdain for that den of caterwauling peasants. By intermission, all society was buzzing about the heiress's apparent mental decline, a theory bolstered by the secretary's tearful confession to a rival's maid about midnight hysterics and incoherent rages. Rumors crystallized into accepted truth with terrifying speed. The woman who'd once dictated fashion now found dressmakers unavailable for fittings. Former friends developed sudden maladies when she called. Even servants grew bold, accidentally serving her cold tea or neglecting to polish her jewelry. Small rebellions that spoke volumes about where the wind was blowing. The secretary stoked every ember, circulating tales of the heiress berating shopgirls, actually her own voice, mimicked flawlessly in crowded tear rooms, and forgetting to pay modistes another ledger trick. The final stroke came at the Belmont wedding, where the heiress arrived to find her place card demoted to a shadowy corner beside the divorced uncle from Milwaukee. As she stood frozen in humiliation, the orchestra struck up a waltz, the same one played the night her emeralds vanished, and the room seemed to sway away from her in unison. That's when the whispers became audible, unstable, unbalanced, and worst of all, the two words that could murder a reputation in Gilded Age society: unfit for company. The secretary, positioned strategically near the punch bowl, watched the dominoes fall with quiet satisfaction. Revenge wasn't just about punishment, it was about rewriting history until even the victim doubted her own sanity. Blood ties might be thicker than water, but they dissolved like sugar in tea when the secretary began her campaign to dismantle the heiress's last stronghold, her family. The groundwork had been laid for years, as she'd quietly noted every sibling rivalry, every parental disappointment, every unspoken resentment simmering beneath the surface of their gilded unity. Now it was time to turn those fractures into fault lines. It began with a letter, or rather, a series of them. The heiress's younger brother, an aspiring playwright whose talents were perpetually overshadowed by his sister's theatrics, received a note supposedly from their father. The handwriting was flawless, the stationery pilfered from his private stock, the contents a scathing critique of his latest work, calling it as shallow as your sister's virtues, with a postscript hinting that funds for his next production would be withheld unless he stopped embarrassing the family. The secretary made sure the letter arrived just as the brother was celebrating a rare positive review, a timing so cruel it snapped his last thread of restraint. He confronted their father at the club, shouting accusations in front of half the Knickerbocker elite. The old man's baffled denial only made him look guiltier. Meanwhile, the heiress's mother, a woman obsessed with ancestral purity, found her prayer book stuffed with anonymous genealogical records. Someone had circled certain names in red ink: a great-great-uncle who'd been a grocer, a cousin who'd married into trade, even whispers of mixed blood in the maternal line. The secretary knew the Countess's greatest fear was being labeled nouveau rich, so she let the documents accidentally fall into the hands of the family's most gossipy archivist. Within days, the matriarch was whispering to her priest about tainted lineage, her paranoia spiraling until she barricaded herself in the country estate, refusing to receive guests until the slander was resolved. But the crowning touch was how the secretary turned the heiress's own words against her. During a rare moment of familial harmony, she'd once drunkenly joked that her brother's plays were only fit for kindling and that her mother's piety was compensation for her lack of chin. Harmless cruelty at the time until those phrases reappeared in forged diary entries, left conspicuously in the library where her siblings took tea. The secretary even staged a scene where the heiress's maid was caught burning what appeared to be a stack of her brother's manuscripts in the fireplace. By the time the family convened for their quarterly financial meeting, the room crackled with such hostility, the butler later swore he saw the chandelier tremble. What made the betrayal so devastating wasn't just the lies, it was the plausibility. The secretary had studied their dynamics like a playwright crafting a tragedy, weaving together half-truths and buried grievances until the family couldn't distinguish her inventions from their own suspicions. When the heiress tearfully denied calling her brother a parasite, her history of casual cruelty made the denial sound hollow. When she swore she'd never mocked her mother's appearance, the others merely exchanged glances. After all, hadn't they all heard her say worse at one time or another? The final blow came when the secretary leaked the family's private ledger to the newspapers, doctored, of course, to show the heiress siphoning funds from her siblings' allowances. The ensuing scandal didn't just fracture their unity, it shattered it. The brother disinherited himself in a blaze of dramatic fury. The mother took to her bed with nerves, and the father, finally seeing his dynasty crumble, blamed the heiress for everything. "You've always been the common thread in every disaster," he hissed before slamming the door of his study for the last time, and through it all, the secretary stood in the shadows, the picture of quiet loyalty, handing out handkerchiefs and murmuring comfort, even as she slipped the last of the real ledgers into her apron pocket. Because the sweetest revenge isn't just watching someone fall, it's making sure they never quite understand who pushed them. The heiress's father kept his will in a lacquered box behind his desk, a fact the secretary had noted years earlier when fetching his spectacles. To the outside world, the document was ironclad, drafted by the family's venerable law firm with all the pomp and precaution of a royal decree, but legal papers, like society's favor, were only as strong as the hands that held them. And those hands, they'd grown increasingly frail, their signature shaky enough to invite creative interpretation. It began with whispers, subtle suggestions to the aging patriarch about his daughter's reckless spending, her unseemly scandals, even her concerning health. The secretary would sigh over misplaced bank statements, frown at exaggerated gossip columns left open on his reading table, and once, with masterful timing, arranged for him to overhear a physician speculating about the heiress's hysteria. Each seed took root, watered by the old man's growing dread of leaving his fortune to a woman who might squander it before the funeral roses wilted. Then came the revisions, a codicil here, a struck-through clause there, all executed during the patriarch's bad spells, those foggy afternoon hours when his vision blurred and his thoughts wandered. The secretary's stroke of genius, she didn't forge the changes outright. Instead, she guided his own hand, murmuring, "Shouldn't the brother oversee the trust?" Or how wise you were to consider the orphanage. The resulting amendments were just erratic enough to seem genuine, just cruel enough to feel like justice. By the final draft, the heiress's inheritance had been funneled into a labyrinth of trusts and charities, with her estranged brother named executor and the secretary herself discreetly earmarked as confidential advisor, a title carrying a stipend generous enough to make a Vanderbilt blink. The true artistry, though, lay in the timing. The secretary arranged for the heiress to discover the will's terms not from grieving lawyers, but from her brother's triumphant sneer at the reading. His glee was genuine. He had no idea she'd orchestrated his sudden windfall. The room itself seemed to tilt as the heiress heard the numbers, her beloved townhouse now a museum, her jewels donated to a convent, even her cherished racehorses willed to a rival's stables. Every asset she'd flaunted, every treasure she'd used as social leverage, now dangled just out of reach. Watching her claw through the paperwork like a starved thing, the secretary allowed herself one small, perfect moment of vindication. Because the cruelest cut wasn't the poverty, it was the dependency. The will's final clause granted the heiress a modest annuity contingent upon her brother's approval of her conduct. The woman who'd once snapped her fingers for champagne would now need to beg for shoe money from the sibling she'd tormented since childhood. And as she crumpled to the floor in a heap of silk and shattered pride, the secretary knelt beside her, not to comfort, but to whisper the words that would haunt her for the rest of her days. shall I fetch your brother's approval for smelling salt?" The secretary didn't just step into the heiress's former life, she redesigned it, stitching her triumph from the very silk threads her employer had once worn so carelessly. Where the heiress had been brash, she became calculated. Where the heiress had been cruel, she wielded power with a surgeon's precision. Society, always hungry for fresh spectacle, barely blinked when the indispensable Miss Ellis began appearing at soirees not as a shadow, but as a guest of honor. Hostesses who'd once ignored her now jostled to claim her attention, sensing the shift in the wind, and the grandest irony, she owed her newfound status to the very woman who'd tried to break her. The turning point came at the Belmont Autumn Ball, the same event where the heiress had once been reduced to a laughingstock. This time, the secretary arrived on the arm of the widowed Duke of Westmere, a man whose fortune dwarfed even the heiress's former allowance. Rumor claimed they'd met while he was researching investments in the very railroad she'd accidentally steered his way through forged correspondence. The Duke, oblivious to her maneuvering, adored her uncommon good sense and refined humility, qualities she'd practiced in the mirror for years while fetching the heiress's shawls. Their engagement announcement, printed in bold type across the society pages, conveniently ran alongside a notice about the heiress's eviction from her leased townhouse. But marriage was merely the opening act. With her husband's influence and her own meticulously cultivated connections, the secretary, now a duchess in her own right, began hosting the sort of salons the heiress had only ever gate-crashed. Her guest lists were masterpieces of social engineering. Artists who owed her patronage sat beside bankers who feared her ledgers, while former rivals fawned over canapes she'd once been ordered to serve. The heiress, now scraping by on her brother's grudging charity, sometimes lurked outside these gatherings, her face pressed against the fogged glass like a ghost of her former self. The sweetest vengeance, though, lay in the details. The secretary wore the heiress's favorite shade of emerald to the opera, laughing too loudly at jokes about social climbers. She hired the same modiste who'd once mocked the secretary's thrift, now commanding her to rip seams until the fit was flawless. And when the old family portraits came up for auction after the patriarch's death, she bought every one, not to cherish, but to line the kennels of her country estate, where her prize greyhounds slept beneath the glowering visages of the bloodline that had dared to call her Little Mouse. Yet for all the glittering theatrics, her true power was quieter. The secretary, no, the Duchess never raised her voice. She didn't need to. A single arched brow could send financiers scrambling to revise contracts. A well-timed sigh at the whist table could ruin a debutante's prospects. The heiress had ruled through fear and fortune, but the secretary commanded something far more enduring, the unshakable certainty that she'd earned every jewel, every curtsy, every whispered tribute. And as she sipped champagne from the heiress's own monogrammed glasses rescued from a pawn shop and polished to a mocking gleam, she allowed herself one private toast to revenge served not just cold, but gilded. The heiress had always believed desperation was for lesser creatures, those without names etched in society ledgers or bloodlines traced back to kings. But as she stood outside the Van Allen mansion in last season's gown, her gloves fraying at the seams, she finally understood the bitter taste of it. Her first attempt at redemption had been laughably transparent, a chance encounter with Mrs. Astor's carriage, engineered so precisely it might as well have been staged, which of course it was. The old matriarch hadn't even lowered her window, merely flicking the curtain aside with a gloved finger before signaling the driver to move on. The message was clear. The woman who'd once commanded ballrooms was now less than the dust beneath carriage wheels. Next came the humiliating pilgrimage to former friends. She tried the Vanderbilt girl first, arriving with a gift of lemon cakes she'd spent her last coins to purchase. The butler took the box with a knowing smirk, only to return it minutes later, the ribbon still perfectly tied. Miss Vanderbilt regrets she cannot accept gifts from unfamiliar persons. The refusal stung, but the real blow came when she glimpsed her rival inside, lounging on the divan beside the secretary. No, the Duchess, their laughter ringing through the open window like shattering crystal. Even the servants, once cowed by her merest glance, now revelled in her downfall. The modiste who'd once scrambled to her fittings now claimed to be booked solid, while fitting a shop girl in muslin right before her eyes. The florist, mistakenly, sent funeral wreaths instead of roses for her ill-fated tea party. Worst of all was the footman at Delmonico's, who pretended not to recognize her, demanding she use the service entrance. She'd slapped him then, the crack of her palm against his cheek echoing through the marble foyer. His slow smile as he rubbed his face was worse than any retaliation. How the mighty fall, he'd murmured, loud enough for the dining room to hear. Her final gamble was the most pathetic, a hastily scrawled letter to the secretary herself, begging for guidance in this temporary difficulty. The reply arrived on parchment so thick it could have lined a coffin, the ink an obscenely cheerful violet. Darling, it began, a word that now felt like a dagger. One so admired for her independence surely needs no help from a little mouse. Enclosed was a single dried pea, the same sort she'd once forced the secretary to count as punishment for a missing button. The cruelty wasn't in the snubs, it was in their precision. Every slight echoed an earlier arrogance, every closed door a testament to how thoroughly the secretary had rewritten history. The heiress had spent a lifetime collecting enemies. Now, in her desperation, she was realizing the true cost not of her cruelty, but of her carelessness, because the secretary hadn't just stolen her fortune or her standing. She'd proven the unthinkable, that the heiress had never been indispensable at all. The world had moved on without her, and not a soul, not one had glanced back. The confrontation unfolded not in a grand ballroom or a lawyer's office, but in the one place the heiress still thought of as hers, the morning room of her father's now mortgaged townhouse. She'd summoned the secretary with a note scrawled in shaky ink, the demand barely concealed beneath the formalities: "We must speak of your treachery." But when the door opened, it wasn't the cowed servant she expected who stepped inside. The woman who entered wore a walking suit of dove-grey silk, her gloves pristine, her bearing that of someone who no longer answered to anyone. The heiress launched her accusation like a spear. "You think I don't know it was you? The letters, the ruined engagements, the will, all of it." Her voice cracked under the weight of months of humiliation. But instead of flinching, the secretary, no, the Duchess merely tilted her head, as if observing a particularly unruly child. "Prove it," she said softly, the words a velvet trap. And there it was, the fatal flaw in the heiress's rage. Every piece of evidence, every damning detail, was either circumstantial or pointed back to her own misdeeds. The forged letters, written on her own stationery, found in her own desk, the sabotaged courtships, fueled by whispers she'd actually uttered in unguarded moments. Even the altered will bore her father's erratic signature. No forger could be blamed when the patriarch's trembling hand was so publicly known. The heiress lunged for her desk, yanking open drawers to produce the ledger she'd stolen from the secretary's room. "This, your little book of lies." She brandished it like a weapon, but the secretary's smile only deepened. "Read the last page," she murmured. Flipping frantically, the heiress found not a catalogue of schemes, but a single line in her own handwriting, lifted from a letter she'd foolishly discarded. "Servants are like stitches. Pull one loose, and the whole garment unravels." The silence that followed was louder than any scream, because in that moment, the heiress understood the true depth of her defeat. This wasn't just revenge, it was a mirror held up to her entire life, showing every cruelty, every carelessness, every time she'd mistaken someone's silence for stupidity. The secretary hadn't just outmaneuvered her, she'd embodied her, turning the heiress's own weapons against her with such precision, even the truth sounded like paranoia. When the heiress finally spoke again, her voice was hollow. "What do you want?" The secretary adjusted her gloves, her gaze drifting to the window where a carriage waited, emblazoned with a ducal crest. "Nothing from you," she said, turning to leave. "You've already given me everything I needed." And with that, she stepped into the sunlight, leaving the heiress alone with the one thing she'd never learned to endure: irrelevance. The scandal didn't just ruin the heiress, it sent shockwaves through the very foundations of high society, leaving the elite questioning who, exactly, they could trust. Overnight, the whispered name of the secretary turned. Duchess became both cautionary tale and dark inspiration, a spectre haunting every employer who'd ever snapped their fingers at a servant. Parlors that once buzzed with gossip about opera singers and inheritance, disputes now erupted in hushed debate over loyalty bonds and staff surveillance. The Vanderbilt matriarch reportedly installed locks on her correspondence desk. The Astors hired a second butler not for service, but to watch the first. Even the most arrogant dowagers began addressing their maids by name, as if politeness could inoculate them against mutiny. What terrified them wasn't just the revenge itself, it was the artistry of it. The secretary hadn't wielded a blunt instrument. She'd stitched her vengeance with surgical precision, threading every slight into a noose made of silken hypocrisy. Suddenly, every misplaced glove or delayed tea tray took on sinister new meaning. A Rockefeller heir fired his valet for looking at him sideways, while a prominent hostess cancelled her daughter's coming-out ball, convinced the florist's color scheme was a coded insult. The elite's paranoia reached such absurd heights that one banker's wife reportedly slept with her jewelry box under her pillow, only to discover the missing pearls had simply rolled behind her vanity. Yet for every employer trembling at shadows, there were a dozen servants leaning in closer. Kitchen maids exchanged furtive grins over scullery buckets, while footmen straightened their livery with newfound pride. The secretary's rise became a secret anthem for the invisible hands that kept gilded lives running, a reminder that filigreed invitations still needed addressing, and champagne flutes didn't polish themselves. Underground betting pools even sprouted among stable boys and seamstresses, wagering which household would implode next. The butler who, accidentally, served the wrong vintage at a Whitney dinner. The lady's maid who misheard instructions about a rival's seating placement. Each minor rebellion carried the delicious whiff of possibility. Meanwhile, the secretary's methods became a sort of dark catechism among the disenfranchised. Laundresses recited the ledger system like scripture, memorizing which scandals could be traded for raises. Governesses practiced mimicking their employers' handwriting, not for forgery, of course, just harmless notes left where husbands might find them. Even the street sweepers outside Fifth Avenue mansions developed a peculiar habit of humming the same waltz that had played during the heiress's final ballroom disgrace, a cheeky reminder that sidewalks, too, had ears. The irony was exquisite. The elite had spent centuries believing their power was unassailable, carved into marble and reinforced by birthright, but in the end, it took just one woman, armed with nothing but patience, a sharp pen, and the quiet certainty that all castles are built on sand, to prove them wrong. And as the Duchess herself might have noted, sipping tea in her new embroidered parlor, the real victory wasn't in the falling, it was in making sure they never stopped hearing the echo. The secretary's revenge was flawless, meticulous, devastating, but as the years unfurled like stolen silk, even she had to wonder whether the price of victory had been paid in a currency that still held value. On the surface, she had everything: a ducal title, the devotion of a wealthy husband, the keys to every gilded door that had once been slammed in her face. Yet those who knew her best, or rather, those who observed her closest, noticed how her laughter never quite reached her eyes during third-act operas, how her fingers lingered a beat too long on locked jewelry boxes, as if expecting them to vanish. The world called it triumph. She knew better. It was vigilance, the eternal tax on those who climb atop ruins they've engineered themselves. Her legacy became a ghost story whispered over sherry in aristocratic parlors. Mothers warned daughters to beware the quiet ones, while surreptitiously auditing their own staff's wages. Fathers tightened inheritance clauses, suddenly hyper-aware of who took notes during family meetings. But the real lesson wasn't about servants or revenge. It was about systems. The secretary hadn't exploited weakness. She'd revealed the lie at the heart of the Gilded Age, that power was innate rather than performed. She'd shown how quickly a society built on borrowed prestige could crumble when someone stopped pretending the emperor's clothes were real. For the elite, the tale became a distorted mirror. Some, like the Astors, responded with performative kindness, raising wages just enough to avoid rebellion, but never enough to share true agency. Others, like the railroad tycoons, doubled down on surveillance, hiring Pinkerton agents to vet staff for undue ambition. The irony was delicious. In fearing another secretary, they missed the broader threat. It wasn't the oppressed who would topple them, it was their own refusal to see that oppression had a ledger and every entry carried interest. As for the secretary herself, she left one final clue to her state of mind. In her otherwise spotless estate ledger, beneath columns detailing art acquisitions and vineyard revenues, a single-line item appeared annually on the same date, the day she'd first entered the heiress's employ. The entry was always identical: charitable donation, school for indentured girls. The amount varied. Some years it was modest, others staggering, but the recipient never changed. An institution dedicated to teaching bookkeeping, penmanship, and the careful study of human nature. The moral of the story depends on where you stand. For the aristocracy, it was a fable about guarding against betrayal. For the servants who passed it down like folklore, it was proof that even the mightiest towers have weak mortar. But for the secretary, now a duchess, now a patroness, now a woman who could order an entire ballroom to silence with the lift of a finger, the truth was simpler. Revenge hadn't made her happy, but it had made her free, and that, perhaps, was the most terrifying lesson of all. The echoes of the secretary's revenge reverberate far beyond the gaslit parlors of the Gilded Age. They pulse through the fluorescent-lit corridors of modern offices, where power imbalances and quiet rebellions still unfold with startling familiarity. Today's workplace might lack corsets and calling cards, but the dynamics of class resentment and calculated payback remain eerily unchanged. Consider the viral story of the Silicon Valley executive assistant who, after years of being mocked for her unimportant role, leaked her CEO's disparaging emails to the entire company during an IPO freeze. Or the hotel housekeeper who documented a billionaire's illegal waste, dumping through meticulously dated photos, toppling his eco-philanthropy brand overnight. The tools have evolved to spreadsheets instead of ledgers, burner phones instead of hidden diaries, but the blueprint is the same: the underestimated insider, armed with patience and receipts, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the lever. What makes these modern parallels so chilling isn't just the revenge itself, it's how effortlessly contemporary power structures mirror the old world hierarchies. The tech bro who treats his assistants like voice-activated furniture isn't so different from the heiress snapping her fingers for champagne. Both assume their status makes them untouchable, blind to the fact that today's invisible employees, the contract workers, the gig laborers, the admins hold the digital equivalent of skeletons in gilded closets. A dismissed Uber driver can tank a CEO's reputation with a single viral tweet. A temp worker overhearing racist comments in the break room now has the power to livestream it before HR even schedules a meeting. The ledger has gone blockchain, and the secrets are indelible, yet the most fascinating shift lies in the collective nature of modern revenge. Where the secretary worked alone, today's underdogs often rally in plain sight through Slack channels and subreddits, crowdsourcing strategies to expose toxic bosses. Take the gaming studio employees who coordinated anonymous Glassdoor reviews to highlight mismanagement, or the restaurant staff who used TikTok to document wage theft through shared spreadsheets. These aren't lone wolves, they're networked insurrectionists, proving that when enough little mice compare notes, they can chew through the foundations of any ivory tower. The lesson isn't that revenge is justified, it's that power is always a performance, and every performance depends on stagehands. From Gilded Age ballrooms to Silicon Valley boardrooms, the people who arrange the scenery, hold the scripts, and witness the unguarded moments ultimately decide whether the show goes on. The secretary's greatest legacy wasn't ruining one heiress. It was revealing a truth that still terrifies the powerful today. No throne is so high that the hands supporting it can't choose to let it fall. So where does justice end and revenge begin? That's the question lingering beneath every twist of this scandal, like a thorn hidden in silk. Was the secretary a villain, meticulously orchestrating ruin, or a victim who simply handed back the poison she'd been forced to swallow? History loves neat endings, but this story refuses to fit in a box because the truth depends entirely on whose gilded mirror you're looking into. To the heiress, of course, the secretary was a monster, a betrayer who weaponized loyalty, but through another lens, she was just a woman who finally stopped absorbing cruelty and started reflecting it, magnified 100-fold. Think of the factory worker who leaks safety violations after years of ignored complaints, or the intern who exposes harassment once the NDAs expire. The tools change, but the dilemma remains. When the system won't bend, is breaking it the only justice left? Here's the uncomfortable truth no ballroom would admit: revenge like this doesn't bloom in a vacuum. It grows in the soil of unchecked power, watered by the arrogance of those who mistake silence for consent. The secretary didn't invent the game, she just learned to play it better than the teacher. And that's what unsettles us most, not the destruction, but the revelation that the people we've ignored might be watching closer than we ever imagined. So what's your verdict, mastermind or martyr? Drop your take in the comments, and if this twisted tale made you rethink who really holds the power in any glittering hierarchy, give this video a like, subscribe for more scandalous deep dives, and share it with someone who knows that the quietest people in the room are often the ones listening hardest. Because history isn't just written by the winners sometimes, it's whispered by the ones they never saw coming.